Good to see everybody here this morning. I know we have some folks that are not going to brave the, I didn't think I'd ever say it again, brave the rain outside. Thankfully, the Lord has seen fit to give us rain when it's not freezing, so there's no ice, no chance of ice, but I know that for a lot of folks driving in the rain, I'll be honest with you, at nighttime, I don't like to drive in the rain, so we need to remember folks who just felt it best to stay home, especially Miss Millie. She's still having some issues, and we want to remember her, and she thought it best to stay home as well. Jeremiah chapter 20 and verse 9. Jeremiah chapter 20 and verse 9. You'd like to go ahead and turn there? Jeremiah is one of those studies that eventually we're going to get to. We've been studying the minor prophets, and we've been studying Joel on Sunday morning, and I really enjoy it. But Jeremiah is one of those. Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet. The weeping prophet. He saw the state of the nation of God, and he wept because of it. He was so saddened by how far God's people had strayed away from him that he could do no more than to proclaim the truth and weep when the people refused to hear what he had to say. Well, that speaks to us even today, doesn't it? How many times after you've gone through something with someone and you see the wickedness in the world, you just want to go home, and you either want to do one of two things. You either just want to hit your head against the wall, or you just cry about it, because it's so saddening to see how far many people in this world have gone away from even not just only Christianity, but just away from having moral, decent behavior. I don't watch the news anymore. I refuse to watch the news. I get what I need from. I get on the internet a little bit, and I do a little bit of reading things that I feel that are necessary for me to know. But you know what? I don't watch the news anymore because I found it to be just utterly depressing because of the depraved nature of man and how they behave. This is what Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet. In Jeremiah chapter 20 and verse 9 we read, "Then I said," Jeremiah speaking here, "Then I said, I will not make mention of him," God, "nor speak any more in his name." So we know here, of course, Jeremiah is solidifying his position as a prophet of God. And he's saying here is, I just made up my mind. I made up my mind that I was not going to make mention of him. I wasn't going to say his name anymore. I wasn't going to mention God. I wasn't going to bring him up. I wasn't going to proclaim him. I wasn't going to do this anymore. And the reason being, of course, nobody was listening. You know, have you ever heard yourself and you talk and you talk and you talk and you realize nobody's paying any attention to what I have to say. You know, never mind that you're speaking truth, you're telling them what they need to hear, but no one is listening to what you have to say. Well, this is the position that Jeremiah finds himself in. I will not make mention of him, nor mention any or speak any more in his name. But there's a problem. Well, it wasn't a problem, it was an issue that Jeremiah had. He says, I'm going to do this. I can't handle this anymore. I just can't do it anymore. I've given up. I've given up on the nations. I've decided that I'm not going to do anymore, but there was an issue. Jeremiah could not get away from this. But his word was in my heart like a burning fire shut up in my bones. You can't. The language here is unmistakable. He is saying that while I have decided that I just can't do it anymore. No one is listening. I can't speak any more of it because no one is listening, and they're mocking me. They're persecuting me for speaking in God's name. I'm just not going to do anymore. I said to myself that I wasn't going to do anymore, but his word was in my heart like a burning fire shut up in my bones. I was weary of holding it back, and I could not. Jeremiah's torn. He's torn between these two positions that he holds. One is that he's tired of beating his head against the wall, figuratively beating his head against the wall. No one is listening and no one is paying attention, and people refuse to hear. On the other hand, he said, what he's given me to say, I can't hold back. I can't hold back with it anymore. That idea, that concept of a fire, he says it's a fire shut up in his bones. That concept of being on, you've heard people say, I'm on fire for God. I've heard people use that term all my life. I'm on fire for God. I'm on fire for God. And I think that's a great terminology. That concept of fire. But Jeremiah's saying there's a fire and it's shut up and it's in my bones and it's from the inside out. from the inside out. I thought this was appropriate, especially with what's been going on, and we see what fire is capable of doing. You've watched the news over the last couple of months, and it's not just, we've had more, certainly the reports that have been coming out of Tennessee, and how horrible and how devastating that is. They showed the Gatlinburg Church of Christ building. It's been burned to the ground. There's nothing there anymore. Luckily, they were fully insured, and they will rebuild, but they're going to be meeting in, I believe, Pigeon Forge or Sevierville for a period of time. But it completely and utterly burnt it to the ground. We've seen the destructive power of fire and what it can do, and I thought, how appropriate is this? The idea of this fire that was shut up in Jeremiah's bones. But what did that fire cause? It would be different if he just had that fire indwelling in him, and it didn't do anything. It just was allowed to sit there and burn. But what did he say? He says, I was weary of holding it back, and I could not. So what did that fire do to Jeremiah? It compelled him to go and do something that he had been told to do. Now his mind, the old concept of the spirit is willing but the body is weak, his body was getting weak. He was getting tired. How long had he been prophesying and preaching to the lost nation? And he'd been telling them all of these things that God had told him to say, and he had been prophesying to them. And prophecy, the concept of, folks, this is what's happening. This is how far you're away from God. This is what's going to happen to you if you remain this far away from God. He'd been telling them what he needed to hear in order for them to come back and do what they were supposed to do. He was tired. Physically, he was tired. He just couldn't do it anymore. But that fire of God was shut up in his bones. It was like burning. And I can't imagine. If you've ever been sick, you know what it's like to sometimes just feel like you're on fire. You're just so hot and you're just burning up. You just have to lay there with a fan blowing on you because that fire is just, and it's burning up from within you. And I think of that concept, but this is a fire that puts him on fire for God. It compels him to do something. And that concept of what does fire do? Jeremiah wanted to quit, but he couldn't because there was a fire in his bones. The question this morning is, do you have a fire in your bones? Is there a fire in your bones for God? Or have we allowed that fire to become a slow smolder? It's not, we're not really worried about forest smolders. We're worried about forest fires. As long as it's just a smolder, nothing's going to happen. But that's not the issue, is it? It's when that smolder becomes a full-blown, raging fire that, guess what? Get out of the way. Because something's going to happen. Fire does a lot of different things. And we're going to talk about that in the concept of our fire in our bones. Do we have that? Is the fire in our bones so great that we cannot stop or we cannot keep from going and doing what we've been told to do? Is that where we are? Well, that's it. What does fire do for us? In Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 18, we got 4 things that fire does for us. Fire is a friend and it's also an enemy, is it not? It's a tool, right? It's a tool to be used. How do we use it? That's the important thing. It said that the fires that started up close to Gatlinburg were actually the product of arson. You think about how horrible that is. And we don't know if somebody said, you know what, I'm going to go out there and I want to burn the town down, or if it was one of those people that, pyromaniacs, they just like to play with fire. They just play with fire and play with fire, and it gets out of control. They don't realize it. They don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if it was somebody it was an accidental thing. We don't know what it was. But fire can either be a good thing for us or it can be a bad thing for us. Let's talk about a few things that fire does for us. Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 18. Fire consumes. Fire consumes. The old the concept of matter is not created or destroyed. It merely changes form. Well, fire makes things change forms. It changes a building like this, and it changes it, doesn't it? It physically changes it, and it makes it ash and soot and cinders and tinder and charcoal on the ground where once a building stood. It takes a vast swath of timber and it reduces it to smoldering ashes. It does all of those things. It consumes, it burns it up. If you take a piece of paper and you light it on fire, if you ask a small child that doesn't understand that it's been transformed into something else, you ask, what happened to that piece of paper? Well, it disappeared. It ate it up. The fire ate it up. In Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 18, we know that fire burns out the sinful and the unnecessary stuff in our lives. Wickedness burns like a fire. In Isaiah 9:18, for wickedness burns as the fire. As the fire. It shall devour the briars and the thorns. It said that on the day when when the parable of the farmer, the enemy had gone out and he had sown tares in the wheat. He says, should we go out and we try to pull them? He said, no. If you do that now, you're going to pull up the wheat as well. Let them both grow up together. We're going to harvest the wheat, and then we'll take the tares, and the tares we will throw into the fire. They will be consumed. It'll consume the bad stuff, and the good stuff we will leave behind. Fire consumes. It shall devour the briars and the thorns, but fire also purges the evil. In Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 9, we see this. It burns, it purges the evil. But in Zechariah chapter 13, verse 9, it gives us another thing that it does. It burns, it consumes out. I will bring the 1/3 through the fire, and I will refine them as silver is refined, and I will test them as gold is tested. They will call upon my name, and I will answer them. I will say, this is my people, and each one will say, the Lord is my God. It consumes the wickedness out. It purges it out. It gets rid of it. It doesn't need it anymore. And this brings us into the next point, that fire purifies. Well, how does fire purify? It makes us clean and it makes us holy before God. That idea of a spiritual fire. It purifies us, as Zechariah said. In 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 7, Zechariah said, I will bring the 1/3 through the fire. It will refine them as silver is refined. Well, how does that happen? Well, what you do is you take an ore, you take a mineral, you take whatever it is that you're trying to refine, and you bring it in and you melt it. It's extremely hot. I watched it being done one time. It's really fascinating. They take this metal with all of its impurities and all the stuff that's inside of it, and you don't take that and start hammering it out into a ring or jewelry. That's not what you want. Because what happens with those impurities? It makes that metal difficult to work with. It weakens it. There's stuff in there that doesn't allow that ring or that jewelry or whatever they're making out of that silver to keep its shape. A lot of times silver is used to conduct electricity in certain things. And if there's impurities in there, that silver is not going to allow that electrical charge to go through there the way it should. It's going to interrupt it. It's going to make it good. So what you need is you need pure silver. So what do? They take this ore and they put it into a big vat. You've seen this probably in 100 documentaries. They take that thing and they build a fire underneath it and they just boil it and they burn it and it heats it up and heats it up and heats it up until it's molten. It's like a liquid. You could pour it like water. And what happens? It's fascinating. All the bad stuff, all the nasty stuff starts to float up to the surface. A lot of the stuff that's in there you can't see, and it just burns it out because of the heat. It gets rid of a lot of that, the gases that are in there, but sometimes you'll see bits of stuff floating up to the top. All this stuff was inside of that ore, but it made it unuseful in the way that it needed to be used. So they heat it up and they heat it up and they heat it up, and when that stuff gets molten and it gets like liquid, they go through and they take that stuff off the top, all the nastiness off the top, the things that were keeping it from being pure. And then all of a sudden you've got this pure silver or pure gold, the kind that you would want to see in a ring, the kind that you would want to see in a pair of earrings, the kind that you would want to use in the way that it's used. You know, the gold plate on the Georgia Capitol building, that had to be almost perfectly pure gold in order for it to be used the way that it was going to be used. It's paper thin. I found it fascinating. I went on a little tour and they said, in order for that stuff to be used, in order for that gold to be plated on top of that Capitol building, it had to be almost 100% pure. Almost 100%. It's almost impossible to get that. But it had to be almost 100% pure, because if they tried to hammer it out into that gold foil or that gold leaf, if there were any impurities, it would just disintegrate. It would disappear. And you'd have big chunks of gold missing from that Capitol building. It had to be perfectly pure. And that concept here in Zechariah, that's what he's talking about. I will refine them as silver is refined through that fire. I will test them as gold is tested. How? Through that fire. They will call on my name. So after we have been tested, what remains? Us. As he refines us, what remains? Us. The pure. The ones who remain faithful. That's who he's talking about here. And what's going to happen to those who remain faithful? We are going to call upon God. And what does he say? This is my people. And each one will say, the Lord is my God. Well, Peter goes into that in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 7. 1 Peter 1, verse 7. Fire purifies. It makes us clean and it makes us holy before God. In 1 Peter 1, verse 7, it says that the genuineness of your faith, the purity of your faith, that's the idea of genuine, means pure. The genuineness of your faith being much more precious than gold that perishes. So even as gold is refined, that gold is still going to be done away with. It's going to be gone. Eventually it will go the way of all things of this earth. Being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So as gold and silver are purified, they are still things of this earth, and they're going to be done away with. But us, the church, as we are purified and we are refined through that spiritual fire, we remain. The church is eternal. The church will never go away. Death cannot destroy the church. No matter what anybody threatens us with, nothing can destroy the Lord's church. People may come and people may go, but the Lord's church remains, and it is eternal. Why? Because we have been purified through a spiritual fire. Next, John chapter 21 and verse 9. Fire does something else for us. It consumes the bad. It consumes the wicked. That spiritual fire. It consumes the stuff that's not necessary. It purifies. We know that fire cheers. Fire cheers us. Let me tell you. I don't know if, I'm trying to remember the story, but there's a story Jack London wrote, and he writes this man goes out and he's in the Yukon. He goes out into the storm, and he loses his way, and he has a companionship and a dog. The dog comes out and is trying to pull him. He finally gives up, and gives up within, I think, like 25 or 30 yards of the camp. And he said, and that's where the fire was. That's where the comfort was. That's where people were there to warm and cheer and to give aid and comfort to him. Fire cheers us. When you're out in the woods, when you're out walking at night and you look around, and where are you always looking back to? You're always looking back to the campfire. Why? Because that's where good things are. That's where you need to be. Fire cheers us. When you have a fireplace, I know even in Georgia they put fireplaces in the houses. Never really understood that. But guess what? We got fireplaces. You know what? Even though they don't give us a lot of heat, there's something about coming into a house where there's a fire in the fireplace and people are gathered around as a sense of comfort. There's a sense of comfort there. And we go to John chapter 21, verse 9, and I think about this, the idea of how fire cheers us. Then as they came to land, what had been happening? All night the apostles had been out on the water and they'd been fishing. So they hadn't caught anything. All night. They had to go back to their jobs. They had to go do something. And they had lost their Savior. He had been crucified. And he had appeared several times, but he wasn't consistently with them. He would appear and then he would go away again. And he would appear again and he would go away again. And they missed him. They missed the camaraderie that they had with him. They missed the brotherhood. They missed that fellowship. And they'd been out all night. And they'd been out on the water and they'd been fishing and hadn't caught anything. And as they were getting closer to the land, they look and they see somebody on the shore. He said, "Have you caught anything?" "No, we haven't caught anything." He said, "Throw your nets over on the right side and you'll catch some fish." They did that. And when they did that, they realized who it was that was speaking to them. They said, "It's the Lord." I love how they said, "It's Jesus." They said, "It is the Lord." And they're so excited to get to the land. And they go as fast as they can, and they put their boat up on that shore. And guess what's waiting for them? Jesus is standing there, their friend, their Savior, their Redeemer, their teacher, their master, the man that meant so much to them that had been crucified not so long before. He's standing there, and what's waiting on them? A fire of coals and breakfast. Think about that for just a second. Think about the symbolism and the idea behind that. All night they had been and not accomplished anything. But when they came near and drew near to Jesus, that's when things got better. And to make everything even better than that, he has a nice hot breakfast waiting for them on the fire of coals. He had food and drink waiting for them. And you can imagine what that was like when they came near and they saw that and they got off that boat. You know how excited they were and how comforting that was for them to get onto that shore and gather around that fire and around that breakfast and to commune and to partake in breakfast with their friend and Redeemer. How incredible that is. We feel the same way. Fire cheers us. I think that's great. I think that's singular to mankind. You know, other animals don't like fire. You can imagine what the wildlife was going through with those fires up in Gatlinburg. Everything's running from it. They're scared of it. Animals don't think the same way about fire as we do. We know that it can be a comforting thing. Fire cheers us. Lastly, in Exodus chapter 13, verse 21, if you want to go ahead and turn there, fire unites us. Well, how in the world does that happen? How can fire unite us? Well, fire can unite us. Fire united the children of God. I've always wanted to learn welding. I don't know, does anybody here know how to weld fairly well? Okay, we got one. I've never learned. I've made an attempt at it, but I promise you, if you see what I've done, you will realize that I'm very much a novice. I play around with it, but you know, you see somebody that's an expert at it, and they can lay down a bead of weld that's just nice, and it's perfect, it's smooth, and it does exactly what it's supposed to do, and it perfectly joins those pieces of metal. And I really think that's special. That's somebody that has mastered it. To me, it's an art form, as much an art form as anything else. Someone who could do a job like that well is impressive to me. And I've always wanted to learn it, just never have. Eventually, I'm hoping to. But if you know anything about welding, a lot of people think they misunderstand what it is. Welding is essentially this. An intense electrical charge is put out through the welding gun, and there's a little rod that comes out through that little gun. You put down your little visor, and you hit that thing. That electrical charge temporarily melts the pieces that are supposed to be joined together. That and the little piece of rod come together, and that they come together and they perfectly join two things that were once separate. Two things that were separate. And depending on the type of welding that you're using, you have to join things that are similar. You can't join, for example, wood and iron. It doesn't work that way. But you can join iron and iron, aluminum and aluminum, bronze and bronze, whatever it might be. They're two things that were once separate, and they're brought together through this intense fire that's brought to power. In Exodus chapter 13, verse 21, fire brings unity to the children of God. And the Lord went before them. And of course, here we're reading about the case after they're in the middle of their exodus. They're leaving the nation of Egypt. They're heading towards this promised land that God has set aside for them. It's sanctified for them. It's waiting on them. All they have to do is get there, and He's given to them. So they are on their way. And what He wants them to do is He says, I want you to follow me. And He uses two very symbolic things to get them to follow Him. But what does He say? And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud, something that would be very obvious in the day sky. You could see the clouds. I can imagine they're looking at it, and they say, well, you know, there's a big cloud pillar. I mean, that's where we go. Man, if we follow that, we're going to get exactly where we need to be. We don't have to wonder. We don't have to worry. Because God didn't show Himself, but He went before them as a pillar of cloud, and they followed that pillar of cloud. But you know, eventually, night falls. The sun goes away, and it's hard to see clouds at night. He says, I still want to be before you, and I still want to lead you. Well, how did He do that? He said, the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day. What do we understand then? That every Hebrew man, woman, and child unified looked to that pillar of fire for their guidance. It unified them. Some didn't go one way, some didn't go another way, and some hang back. Well, we're going to follow this. Well, we're going to follow this. Well, we're going to stay here and wait on another revelation from God. No, every single one of them, as they're heading towards that promised land, saw that pillar of fire and said, we are coming together as a nation of God's people, and we are going to a place that He has promised us. We see ourselves in that, right? We still follow. We still follow because every man, woman, and child in us is headed to a place that has been prepared for us. It is there, and it's waiting on us. Jesus Christ Himself went to prepare a place for us, and when He has prepared it, He's going to come back and He's going to receive us to Himself. Fire unifies us. We're unified. As the Lord's church, we're unified. We may have petty squabbles every now and again, but what family doesn't? The point is that we get past those, we work through those, and we remain unified. We remain unified through the purifying spiritual fire of God, He has purged out the bad, and he has remaining to himself the good. And he says to us even today, these are my people. And what is our response to that? This is our God. So many different things that fire does. It's not just a destructive thing, as so many people and the animals look at it as sheerly destructive. They don't like fire. But we know that it is a tool for good, and it does good things if it's used in the right way. Is there a fire in your bones? Is there a fire in your bones this morning? Is what God has put in you so great that you can't quit? You can't quit. Your heart is telling you, you can't quit this. This is too great. You can't ignore this anymore. I know things are difficult. I know things are stressful. I know things are arrayed against you. I know that you're having all kinds of problems, but guess what? This that's inside of you is so great that you cannot give up. You have no choice. You are compelled to continue. That's the kind of fire that we have to have. If we're going to call ourselves children of God, if we're going to call ourselves followers of God, that's what we have to have in our bones. That fire that just heats us up from inside and we can't help it, but put it out there. And let people know exactly who it is that we serve and who exactly it is that watches over us. That's the question. Do you have a fire in your bones? If you don't, why not? Is there something that we could do to stoke that fire again? The best fire that we can build as men eventually is going to burn out. What has to happen? We have to stoke it again. We have to get in there and we have to put a little fuel on it. We have to give it a little bit of oxygen. We have to poke it a little bit. We have to make it roar up again. There may be some people here that we had a fire. It's just kind of smoldering right now. It's not active and roaring as it was in Jeremiah's bones. It's kind of died off. What do we need? We need some fuel. Well, what can we fuel it with? Fuel it with prayer. We can pray for you. That fire roars back up again, and that you can't help but let it out and let people know exactly who it is that you serve. If you need that, we want to do that for you this morning. We want to pray for you. If you've never become a New Testament Christian, you can't have a fire if that fire hasn't been lit, and that fire can only be lit by God. We want to help you light that fire this morning. You need to become a New Testament Christian. We want you to do that this morning. Whatever your need might be, whatever it is, please come. Let us know about it while we stand and while we sing.